welcome to everyone on this presentation as part of the Insights on Demand series for Cambridge University Press and Cambridge Assessment. My name is Judith Kormos, and in this presentation I'm going to ask the question whether it's better to use our eyes or ears, and I will also discuss whether there are any benefits, and if there are, what these are, of listening while reading for dyslexic and non-dyslexic English language learners. So I hope you will find this talk interesting, and let us get started. Why is this question important? Why did I decide to do research on this question? One of the reasons is that a large proportion of our students have specific learning difficulties, which include dyslexia. And traditionally, these students have been neglected in our classrooms, although we now put much more emphasis on inclusion, and there is increasing amount of research also on how students with specific learning difficulties acquire additional languages. Students with specific learning difficulties constitute not only a relatively large proportion of learners in our classrooms, but they are also test candidates when they participate in language exams. And it is really important to construct fair and valid tests that do not cause any bias for students with specific learning difficulties. That is, they are accessible for everyone. And the question is, how can we achieve that students with SPLDs, that the needs of students with SPLDs, such as dyslexia, are taken into account, and that these learners are not unfairly disadvantaged in assessment by, for example, certain test administration conditions or test design features. One of the most important components or subtypes of dyslexia are reading difficulties. And just as dyslexic students experience challenges in reading in their first language and in general in acquiring literacy skills, they also find reading in another language quite difficult and challenging. And it's important to support the reading process of these students in the classroom, and also to think about how we can design tasks that perhaps alleviate some of these reading difficulties for our test takers. So there is a scarcity of research on students with specific learning difficulties. There are many reasons for this. One of them, they are not as easily accessible as a group. Often there is a lack of official diagnosis. And because they constitute, although 10% is a large percent when it comes to doing research, perhaps if you survey 100 students, you only have 10 who are dyslexic, so that causes statistical problems. So there is a research niche in general when it comes to studying students with specific learning difficulties, but we know relatively little about what special arrangements, adjustments in an exam students with SPLDs could receive to demonstrate the full range of their abilities, and how these special arrangements affect their performance, because maybe we're offering special arrangements that do not lead to any improvement in students' performance. So, as I may have mentioned, there is a scarcity of research in this area, and specifically on reading assessment. And we knew of no previous research on the effects of how reading while listening or listening while reading affects second language assessment at the time when we conducted our study. So what was our research about? Our research question asked how the comprehension of dyslexic and non-dyslexic children is affected by the mode of delivery of the text. So that is whether we ask students to read or just to listen, or read and listen at the same time. Our study was conducted in Slovenia with young learners of English. Participants were dyslexic and non-dyslexic. And this was part of a research project that I conducted with Carmen Pijorn, Milena Kosak-Babudar, and Michael Ratajczak at the University of Lancaster, and the Slovenian colleagues worked at the University of Ljubljana. The university has access to many primary schools in Slovenia who are willing to participate in research projects like this. How did we research this question? As I have mentioned, we asked students to read a text, read and listen to a text at the same time, or just listen to the text. And we measured their comprehension on 4 texts, and the students had to answer short questions about what the specific information in the text. And we were again very fortunate to have access to a standardized battery or a set of the Slovenian National English Language Test, which is administered annually to students to have diagnostic information about the English language knowledge of the Slovenian language learner population. Now, after this very brief introduction, I'd like to just give you an overview of what my talk today aims to achieve. First of all, I'd like to give you some background on certain essential concepts and research that is important to understand before I present our project. And there are certain terms which are very useful from an assessment perspective, such as universal design and fairness. But some of these terms are also important in everyday language teaching classrooms. And also, we as teachers often administer classroom-based tests, and we should think about universal design, fairness, accommodations, modifications in our classroom tests as well, not just in high-stakes summative assessment. After I have covered this theoretical ground, I will describe the research methods of our study and the findings. And then at the end of this presentation, I will outline some implications for assessment and language teaching pedagogy. Let me start by discussing the 2 key concepts underlying our study and that are really important for fair and valid assessment. And some of these 2 concepts are universal test design and special arrangements. Universal design is a relatively recent concept in educational research, and it is primarily concerned with accessibility. And it puts the responsibility on the designer of the test or the designer of the educational materials to make sure that we create tests, educational materials that are accessible for people with different visual, hearing ability, learning needs, etc. And that we also provide options for students to decide in what ways they want to access information, or what they in what ways they want to express themselves to respond to information, instruction, etc. Now, of course, because we are talking about the assessment of language skills and assessing input modes, so reading and listening, and writing and speaking are key parts of the construct. The traditional concept of universal design in education is slightly has a slightly different meaning in assessment context. What the main message of universal design features is that tests should be constructed and administered more flexibly so that accommodations for students with specific needs do not become necessary, and we have to preempt what kind of needs our test takers would have. And again, of course, fully universal design is not possible, but we have to do our best to make sure to minimize that our test is constructed in a way that creates systematic bias to certain types of candidates with certain characteristics, and that we have certain features of the task that create construct irrelevant variance. And let me give an example for this. So for example, if you have a listening test, you have to measure students' understanding of that text somehow, and you usually do it with comprehension questions that students have to answer in writing. And if you set up a text in which the comprehension questions are long, then there is a lot of demand in terms of reading processes. And then if students have to write long answers, then again, we are also including some of the writing construct in the assessment. And particularly if we deduct points for spelling in answering the listening questions, then there is clearly a construct irrelevant factor in our assessment. And this assessment systematically disadvantages those who have reading and writing difficulties, that is, students who have SPLDs. So this is why it's really important to examine the tests that we design in terms of the construct and systematic bias. Now, as I have said, universal design isn't always possible in tests, and sometimes we need to modify the test. And our modification can influence the construct to be assessed. This can happen when we use only a portion of the test, or using a substitute test or alternate assessments. Again, the listening test is a good example for hearing impaired candidates. We obviously cannot assess their listening if their hearing impairment is such that they cannot hear the text. And in this case, we omit this component of the test, and we make a note on the certificate that this aspect of the performance hasn't been assessed. There are, however, ways in which we can implement accommodations or adjustments in our test that doesn't affect the construct that we are assessing. This can be, for example, modifying the presentation format of a reading text by using bigger font size, breaking it up into shorter sections, modifying the response format by, instead of asking students to write long answers, maybe underlining the correct answers, matching answers, etc. We can give our students more time to complete the test. A lot of the second language competence components are not time constrained, so time is not part of the construct that we are assessing. And we can also modify the test setting. So for example, students with attention deficit disorder or Asperger's syndrome, they might prefer working on their own in a quiet room, and that can assist them in performing to the best of their abilities. After having reviewed these two key constructs, let us have a look what happens in reading comprehension, because we need to understand the construct of reading to be able to decide what changes in the test constitute a modification or an accommodation, and how we can best assess the specific aspect of reading that we want to measure in our test. So very simply put, when we read, we first visually decode the letters that we see on the page, and then we transform these letters into sounds. And this is a quick automatic process if you are a proficient reader. And then you compile the sounds to form the phonological form, the sound form of words. And you very quickly, hopefully, recognize the meaning of this stream of sounds. Then the words coming one after the other are put together in a process called syntactic integration or parsing. You create the grammatical structure by reading words coming after each other, and then this helps you to construct the meaning of the sentence. And then once you have done that, you can start constructing text meaning by taking into account your background knowledge, what has been said previously, predicting what's going to happen next, and also not just understanding factual information in the text, but also implying or deducting what information is not being said explicitly but is implied in the text. And then you also monitor your comprehension and you check whether your understanding has been correct or not. So this is reading comprehension in a nutshell. The question is, what happens if we offer students the opportunity to read and listen to a text at the same time? When we listen to a text, then the letter decoding component is not present, right? So you remember from the previous slide, you don't have to decode the written form of the word and you don't have to decode letters. Instead, you're listening to the incoming stream of sounds, you're identifying sounds, and then you are putting the sounds together to form the phonological form of the word that is the one that you hear. And then the rest of the processes for listening comprehension actually are very similar to reading comprehension from that point on, because you do syntactic parsing, construct sentence meaning, use background knowledge to infer text meaning, etc. So when we offer students the opportunity to listen while they read, we may not be testing word level decoding, the letter recognition and the recognition of the written form of the word. Although students might still read these and they might be engaged in written decoding as well, but maybe they use the listening channel for this. So because word level reading is part of the reading construct, especially for lower level learners where we want to assess can they recognize words, higher level learners, we can assume that some of this is automatic. So in read-aloud, students do not decode or may not decode the written form of the words. And in this respect, read-aloud is a modification. But we can still think about whether we should offer this modification to students, maybe in larger scale testing as well, with noting it on their certificates that this is how they perform the text, or in classroom assessment, or we can think about how does this support our students when we use, for example, a course book reading text and there is a recorded version, whether we should allow students to read and listen at the same time. And in today's multimedia world, this multimedia input is quite typical. We often watch films with subtitles, and for a lot of the materials on the internet, there is always the option of transferring things from text to speech. So, having covered theoretical ground for our research, let's have a look at the research questions that we asked in this study. Our question was how mode of presentation, a one factor leading listening, reading while reading, then dyslexia status, so whether the students had an official dyslexia identification, and we also assessed students' first language abilities, and text difficulty. We asked students to read two different texts differing in their difficulty, individually, alone, and in interaction with each other, because it's possible that one mode of presentation is beneficial for students with dyslexia, but perhaps is not so for students who don't have learning difficulties. So we were interested in the individual effect of these variables and how they interact with each other among young Slovenian learners of English And again, with regard to Slovenia, the language learning context in that country is very similar to learning contexts in many instructed classroom language learning contexts. Students are exposed to English in the classroom in an instructed format, and of course they are exposed to English through other multimedia products, but English otherwise is not widely used in the society for communication, at least not in an everyday manner by the students. So the participants it was quite a large sample size. We wanted to make sure that our statistical conclusions have power, are meaningful. So we had 233 non-dyslexic and 47 dyslexic year 6 learners. You can see the gender distribution here, and the students were roughly aged 11 to 13. So this is again a relatively typical language learner population, especially in Europe. Their level of competence was A2. Students start learning English in year 4 in Slovenia. So these were the 4 texts that students had to read. One was about camping, the other one was about pirates, one was about maximum tasty ice cream, and the floating school. So as you can see, the texts were chosen to be interesting and motivating to read for the students. You can see in the slides that the text differed in reading difficulty, which particularly when it's measured with the text evaluator score, you can see that the Sandy Camping and the Maximum Tasty have a higher difficulty than the Pirates and the Floating School, and this is also reflected in the other measure, which is the Flash Kincaid index. The length was slightly shorter for the Floating School, but ranged between roughly 150 to 300 words. And when we asked a native speaker to read out the text, we took into account the reading speed in audiobooks and slowed that down slightly so that it would be accessible to the students. Just to show you the text, this is what it looked like, and students had to answer briefly by giving short answers to comprehension questions that ask for specific information, main ideas. Even though we had official identification of dyslexia as information about the students made available to us, and the dyslexia identification system in Slovenia is very comprehensive and reliable, we still wanted to have additional information about the students' low-level first language literacy skills to make sure that indeed students in our pool classified as dyslexic are indeed dyslexic and have certain challenges with low-level first language skills. We chose 4 tasks from a special needs assessment profile, which is longer, so we didn't have all the time to administer every task. But these 4 tasks included timed reading of existing words. We counted how many words students can read accurately within 1 minute. These were Slovenian words. Then we administered a phonological awareness test where students had to manipulate sounds of words. Again, this was a relatively short test. Then we also asked students to read words which conform to the phonology of the Slovenian language but are non-existent words, nonsense words. Again, the time limit for doing this was 1 minute, and we counted how many words students read accurately. And finally, we dictated words to students in Slovenian, and again, we measured how many words they can write down in 1 minute. This is, just a fraction of a battery of potential dyslexia tests. Nonetheless, they give good insights into skills that can predict reading difficulties. And indeed, our results showed that dyslexic students, performed significantly lower on all 4 of these texts than their non-dyslexic counterparts. The procedures of the research looked like this. Students were divided into 9 groups. In research, it's really important to make sure that you present things in different orders, so that, for example, if we had always the reading and listening text as task 3, then maybe the effects we would find would be due to the fact that the students are tired. So it's important to use what we call a counterbalanced design in research, and to use different combinations of order in which you present the input, the research stimuli to your participants. It wasn't possible to use a fully counterbalanced design with these all different combinations, but what you can see here is that, let's say if a student belonged to group 1, then they read 2 texts in written format, then they listened to text 3, and then they listened and read text D at the same time, and then we varied all these different order combinations to the extent that we could, given the sample size. And then they did the SNAP test, the test that I just described in the previous slide about their first language abilities in Slovenian individually. These were administered in groups. So now, how did students do in the reading text, in the reading element of the test, when they had to read only? And I wonder if you have any predictions about the performance on the reading text. How are dyslexic students going to do in comparison with non-dyslexic students? What are your predictions? You can put them in the chat box, or you can think about these predictions. I give a couple of seconds for you to put your predictions in the chat. Okay, so let's see. You can see 2 parts of the analysis, one for the difficult text and one for the relatively easy text. You can see that the blue column is the total sample, so that's everybody. And indeed, the easier text, where the text input was easier for the students, they scored higher. So that's one conclusion we can draw for the whole sample. What you can see also, that there is a difference both for the dyslexic and non-dyslexic students in terms of the mean values between the difficult and the easy text. And then you can also see the relatively large difference, particularly with regard to the difficult text, between the dyslexic and non-dyslexic students. Out of curiosity, we did another study and another analysis where we looked at how individual students perform dyslexic students in comparison with non-dyslexic students. And it's important to mention that there were actually around 3 or 5 dyslexic students out of the 40-something who performed above average in comparison with their non-dyslexic peers. And there were quite a large number of dyslexic students also in the average reading category, and of course the below average reader category was mostly constituted of dyslexic students. But there is also the lesson there that not every dyslexic student is similar in terms of second language reading ability, and some can succeed Many do struggle, but we also found non-dyslexic, officially non-identified dyslexic students who are struggling with reading. So again, the lesson is that not every student who performs perhaps under average or more poorly on a reading text is necessarily dyslexic. So we need specialized assessment in this area. What do you think about the listening test? What is your prediction? Do you think that dyslexic students will be better? Will we see less difference between dyslexic and non-dyslexic students in the listening area? Please feel free to put your predictions in the chat box. How are dyslexic students going to do here? Are you expecting a different pattern here for listening? Well, if you were, then probably your predictions were not accurate. We see very much a similar figure. In fact, even for the difficult text, dyslexic students are doing far worse than their non-dyslexic counterparts. For the easy text, the difference is somewhat smaller. One reason perhaps is that these texts were meant for reading. Students had to find specific information. So again, because dyslexic students can have challenges with remembering information, phonological processing, working memory, they might find remembering text or focusing on listening text more challenging. So that's for listening. It's probably against your predictions or expectations. Now, how about the read-aloud test? Do you think it's going to help students with dyslexia? Is it going to raise scores across the board? Let's see what happens. You can again put your predictions in the chat box. Right, so here we see a different picture. If you look at the difference between the difficult and the easy text, it's also smaller. But what is quite interesting is that here the difference between the performance of the dyslexic and non-dyslexic students becomes smaller. So indeed, perhaps this is more helpful for students who have dyslexia. Now, this was just eyeballing, looking at the data without doing any statistical analysis. In order to make any statistical or make any predictions that are not due to chance, because some of these can be due to chance, you always conduct statistical analysis. I'm not going to go into the details. This was a very complex statistical model, but what you can see here is the little asterisks, and that the mode of presentation was a significant factor, that dyslexia status was a significant factor. So it's highly significant, actually, with 3 dots in the P column. There is some interaction between mode and text difficulties. So it seems that some presentation mode is perhaps better for one type of text over the other. And there is an interaction between presentation mode and dyslexia status. So certain presentation mode is more beneficial for students with dyslexia. So in line with what you could observe in the previous slide and in the figures, I'd like to just summarize the multiple comparisons. So what we found when we did the statistical analysis is that there were no significant differences between the different modes for non-dyslexic students for difficult and easy texts. Also, that there are no significant differences between modes for dyslexic students for easy text. So if you're dyslexic, if the text is easy, read aloud is not going to help you. However, when it comes to dyslexic students and difficult texts, then students perform best on the read-aloud assistance condition. In the listening only and reading only condition, they perform similarly. So it seems that indeed for the difficult text, there is a benefit. And students perform better in the reading only than in the listening only condition. So that again speaks to the working memory issues that students with specific learning difficulties might have. And what we see, and you saw that in the slide, is that significant differences were found between dyslexic and non-dyslexic participants in all modes except for the read-aloud assistance mode. And dyslexic students are better in understanding easy listening text than difficult ones. So that's again due to their working memory limitations. So if we want to visualize the results, and some of the things I have already mentioned, is that not only reading in a second language, but also comprehending orally presented information is challenging for young dyslexic learners. And this is due to the working memory limitations and possible language comprehension problems of language learners. This slide shows another visual representation of how we can interpret these findings. So for dyslexic students, listening to the text, especially when it's difficult, relieves the processing burden of visual word decoding. This facilitates the accurate word recognition and retrieval of the meaning of the word. And as a result, it frees up working memory resources for higher level text comprehension. If your attention is not preoccupied with lower level word decoding, you can pay more attention to the meaning of the text. And as a result, dyslexic students benefit from reading aloud more than non-dyslexic students when the text is challenging. When the text is easy, perhaps the benefits are smaller. So briefly, the conclusions of the study. In low-stakes assessment context, especially classroom assessment, for example, read aloud might assist students with dyslexia to demonstrate their comprehension abilities, especially if the text is difficult. And again, you might use it in your classroom teaching as well, particularly with lower-level learners for whom the word decoding processes are not yet automatized. The opportunity to use read-aloud modification might lower students' text anxiety and perhaps boost their self-confidence as well because they perform better. Read-aloud in general might increase engagement with second language text and second language learning and might result in some more increased second language motivation. And in high-stakes text, of course, endorsement on the certificate is needed if you provide this accommodation because read aloud changes the construct to be assessed. So just briefly, when we consider the findings of the study, it's important to think about universal design, differentiation in instruction and assessment, offering certain modifications to students, and sometimes also individualized support. And let me end the presentation by giving you just a few tips for how we can ensure accessibility for students with different cognitive abilities when it comes to reading and when we want to counter some of the working memory limitations, slower processing speed and lower attention capacities. The changes we can make in our teaching is dividing text into smaller units, changing comprehension tasks so that they require less reading and writing, modifying text and comprehension task length, and offering students glossaries and dictionaries to support their reading in the classroom context. And for supporting comprehension, in our teaching, we can activate background knowledge based on titles, subtitles, heading, visuals, using prediction and visualization, monitoring comprehension, teaching students how to assess that they understand a text well, how to make inferences. We can encourage them to reread the text or listen again. And also we can teach them how to annotate a text, highlight certain things, make notes, and use mind maps and concept maps. So big thank you to my research collaborators in Slovenia and Lancaster. And this is the study in full if you want to read it. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I hope you will find the rest of the presentations today interesting and relevant. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box or contact me. Thank you very much. Goodbye.